All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to today's stream. Another Just Chatting stream. Let's bring ourselves in. Everything's up, everything's working. Okay, we're good. Right. Not too much to roll through today, I hope. I'd like to be out of here inside of a couple of hours, but we'll have a look and see what we have coming through. Okay, we're going to hit some military type news first and then roll through. A lot of the stuff is sort of follow on to things we've talked about previously. We've got some other articles, depends on how fast we get through things, but ultimately they're all, by and large, articles that tie into stuff that's already been talked about. The first thing that comes up was an article seen on the ABC this morning, where the headline was basically drawing a link between Saab, the manufacturer of said missile, and human rights harm at Lake Hart. Lake Hart is a site near Woomera, which is a defence site in South Australia where they have missile and rocketry testing and a missile range. The concern initially is, well, they've got a couple of locals who are linked to the Aboriginal traditional owners of the area who found the missile, and then rather than just report it for defence to come and safely remove, they have alleged a human rights violation and taken things in all sorts of weird directions and pushed for things that I don't know that they're enforceable. And there is, as we get through the article, there's some areas later on which don't seem to make a lot of sense in terms of, okay, quite obviously they feel aggrieved, but it was previously a range. So there will potentially still be UXO, unexploded ordnance, scattered about, or it's adjacent to a range, and so there is still the potential for weapons ordnance to depart the range. Now, obviously, that's less than ideal. The concern here is obviously it's an RBS 70, and that is used by air defense systems. It's not. I know it says it's an anti-aircraft missile. And so presumably if they were going to go out and test fire their RBS 70s, make sure their systems are all working, make sure it's all good, yep, they'd head up to Woomera to do it, which kind of makes sense, really. I don't know of many gunnery ranges or missile ranges within Australia where the ground defence, air defence assets could go and fire their missiles. Now, missiles on Navy ships will be fired actually in naval gunnery and missile ranges. Air-to-air aircraft missile usage will take place in specified air-to-air ranges or air-to-ground ranges. So there's, some scattered around the country, but as far as I'm aware, there's not really any other sites other than up at Woomera to do this sort of missile firing. So it was found 100 metres from an early Aboriginal structure, so near a site. Okay, fine. You can't predict where sometimes these things end up. I heard from a couple of guys back when Australia had the F-111s. They used to do a lot of bombing practice up on the range at Evans Head, far north New South Wales. And whenever their air-to-ground bombs didn't detonate, someone would have to go out in the range and find out why. Was it a fuse? Was it the bomb itself? And make it safe. And they were telling me the story of one of their drops had resulted in the weapon sudden or porpoising. I think that's what they call it. Basically, the fuse didn't do its job, and so the weapon entered the ground intact. But because of how the bombs are targeted and the flight path they actually follow, it porpoised under the ground, and so it impacted the ground and then followed a path under the ground and emerged a little bit further downrange and kept on flying. And then they eventually found it significantly downrange from the initial impact point. But that's one of those things why the ranges are so big and why the drop points are seemingly a long way away from the edges of ranges, because you just can't always predict what's going to happen. Smart weapons are surprisingly dumb at times, and an RBS-70 isn't that smart. And even if they're not smart weapons, ballistic profiles and all those sort of things make it complicated when ordnance is used. And so this, well, being adjacent to an active range, not really a surprise. It's going to happen from time to time. Ideally, very rarely. So the idea that when they asked to go back, they were told, no, you can't go because there's a missile there. Well, that's just a safety thing. And then they're complaining that it was defense stopping them from going on country. It's not a racist thing. It's not something that is denying Aboriginal heritage. It's a safety thing. It's a case of defense have an obligation then for safety. They've been notified of some unexploded ordnance that is in ordnance that is in an unknown state. So it may be inert. It may have fuel still on board. May have, like, its propulsion system may still be partially fueled or partially activated. There's a lot of dangerous things surrounding missiles and ordnance. That's not just the bit that blows up. Going back decades, I don't know if I'm not sure if they still use it, but there used to be a fuel that was used in particularly anti-submarine warfare. It was called auto fuel. And I mean, it was used in a broad range of uses, but was kept largely for undersea stuff because it could operate effectively anaerobically. In other words, you didn't need a constant supply of fresh air in order for this fuel to work. The downside is it's extraordinarily toxic. And so any weapon that still had partial fuel was toxic, irrespective of whether the warhead was still there or it was inert or whatever. So the mere fact that you've got something that looks like a weapon sitting there, you've got to go and investigate to work out, well, one, what sort of weapon is it? Is it active? Is it inert? Is it fueled? Is it defueled? What are the toxic elements associated with it? And then safely recover it and dispose of it. So it's not a case of them being racist towards the Aboriginal community here. No, it's safety. But instead they choose to have a complaint. They choose to complain about it. So, yep, an RBS-70 short-range anti-aircraft missile. Fair enough. Okay, but then it prompted a 4-year investigation by the OECD. Now, that seems a bit weird. I've never heard of the OECD being involved in these sort of things before, well, in anything like this. Not sure what remit they have. And it's it doesn't make sense that they've gone and done this unless they've tried to find somebody who's going to listen to their grievance and therefore give them what they're after. I mean, don't know what they're after exactly. The initial response from defence, which is fair, is that it could include UXO or other dangerous materials and must not be touched, removed, or otherwise interfered with, because, yeah, they don't know what it is until they go and have a look. And so, I mean, the article's pushing this idea that, oh no, it's all big and scary and dangerous, and they can't 100% guarantee and tell us it wasn't live. Well, because they need to go and have a look. You can't magic these things out of thin air. I think there's an unrealistic expectation from these two brothers that found it, that somehow defence was supposed to magically know the full answers to what was happening, because then they have to do their own investigation, because it may have been, I mean, it could have been there for years, or it could have just recently arrived from a recent firing. So you've got problems associated with the ranges. And, yep, clean range policy, which is obviously pick up which of fire. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with what defence says there, or the attempt to remediate debris from tests in warmer prohibited area, which is the missile and rocketry range. And eventually they were able to determine it didn't contain hazardous or explosive materials, so presumably the motor was burnt out, and it was a test missile. I don't know enough about an RBS-70 to say identify that, but I mean, a lot of these systems will have visual identifiers to tell you whether they're live or inert, and what sort of system. Well, you tell the shape, what sort of system they are, but there's generally identifiers on the weapon itself that'll tell you without having to pull it apart to tell. Okay, so I mean, the fact that they've gained native title, awesome, good for them, including a large part of the range. Okay, well, now it seems that they're starting to have this disconnect between what the native title is and the fact that they've got an active rocketry range super adjacent to them. The site was a site of Aboriginal significance, and give me 2 seconds. Right. Okay. So, yeah, it's a site of significance to the locals, fair enough. But outside the firing range, also fair enough. But now the fact that there's ordnance has been found there, they lodge complaints with SARB and the OECD. Now, I can understand having a complaint against the Department of Defence, because they're the ones that ultimately owned it and fired it. But SARB is the manufacturer. Okay, now you're drawing a bit of a long bow. And the OECD, like, what say do they have in the matter? And, well, I think they're being a little bit delusional here, thinking that the OECD investigation is going to force weapons manufacturers to take more responsibility for the products. SARB built an RBS-70. The missile apparently worked. SARB don't have direct responsibility for where that ends up. Now, if their missile blew up in the launcher. Okay, maybe there's defective manufacturing. There's nothing to say that the guidance wasn't working properly. There's all sorts of bits and pieces. Now, they've said, oh, your defence fire them, go pick up your rubbish. That's all we ask for. Well, no, you're not. You're complaining to the OECD and lodging complaints with Saab. That's not just asking Defence to go pick their stuff up. In fact, back up here, Defence already said it takes it very seriously and regularly updates its clean range policy and what it does. But these guys are like, yeah, no, we're going to ignore that. We're going to go complain to Saab and the OECD. And the ABC is going to support that. So it was removed 3 years ago. So why is it? Yeah. So it's complaining. And see, the OECD only issues guidelines, but there's no obligations for people to have to follow them. And so the idea that a missile plopping down out of a range is a breach of human rights, it leaves you scratching your head, trying to work out under what sort of justification this could be. And there've been nuclear testing carried out in various sites. Now, you could argue that nuclear testing carried out on Aboriginal lands back in the day might be a human rights violation, but I mean, that would need a lot of arguing. But the OECD said, look, okay, Saab Australian Saab Group are directly linked to human rights harms. Because where it landed stopped them from accessing traditional land for a little bit. No, I mean, they're taking things way out of proportion. I mean, Defence came and removed it relatively quickly after they were notified of it. It's like, well, I don't... Other than having an avenue to complain and claim human rights abuses, there's very little to it. It's almost a non-event. And them taking this opportunity to try and claim human rights abuses, it's like this sort of thing doesn't help the broader community's acceptance and support of native title or claims where it's the state versus Aboriginal people over whether a site is going to be acknowledged as culturally significant or things like that. It erodes support because people can't see how this connects, and so they see the argument as being one of, well, why? As in, okay, was it an intentional act to deny them access? I mean, if you want to take another recent example, look at the destruction of Aboriginal rock shelters in Western Australia due to mining activity, where the mining company claimed that surveys had been done, it was all appropriate and everything was okay. Okay, I think people there are more supportive of the claims from the Aboriginal people that, look, these were significant to our heritage and they were destroyed or otherwise interfered with. Yep, okay, I think that's pretty clear cut, and you can't reconstitute or rehabilitate it. It's gone. It's destroyed. Whereas here, it was like, okay, we'll pick it up and clean up after ourselves. Done. Problem solved. 3 years ago. Problem solved. As I said, they picked it up in early 2022. So why continue complaining to the OECD? Again, what does the OECD have to do? And good old cameras having fun with arm detection today. But yeah, and it's like, how did they... Saab failed to undertake adequate human rights diligence between 2011 and 2022. And it's like, Saab has not assessed the downstream impacts of its weaponry production and supply. That is, the impact the use of its weapons may have on human rights. Uh, yeah, and it's that the emphasis from the investigation was that it's the way in which the Australian government had used the RBS 70 that resulted in the human rights harm. That, I mean, you could take that argument and apply it to any weapon system used anywhere. Does that mean that the weapon systems that Australia is supplying to Ukraine result in human rights harm as well? Or any weapon system that's being used actively in combat is human rights harm? Well, how about all the nations that have recently pulled out of the Ottawa Treaty, which is the anti-personnel mine ban treaty? That's clearly demonstrating harm to people. So, uh, that's that. See, this statement here about the harm has arisen from use of weaponry in the range, not cleared from traditional lands for a period of potentially 20 to 30 years. This exam, I think, is being a bit deluded as well. The idea or the difficulty that comes with cleaning an active firing range or a formerly active firing range is insanely difficult, especially given for how long Woomera has been used for and the purposes it was used for. I don't think you could ever confidently say that where an active firing range has been, it's going to be made safe. I mean, farmers in France still get an iron harvest from time to time. So the battlefields of World War One are still turning up unexploded ordnance. They're still digging up. They're still finding World War II bombs buried in cities across Europe. There's places that basically humans can never return to because of how dangerous the minefields and abandoned military equipment are from them. It's the fact that Defence is going to an effort to clean up the site and make it as safe as possible is a good thing. But no, it's the idea that the fact there's been a firing range, it's upsetting to people. Again, but the OECD's got no dog in the fight. It's like, okay, the discovery of the ordnance, so finding the missile, caused distress and a well-founded fear for personal safety, as well as concern there may be other missiles at the site. Yeah, okay, fair enough. The idea that you find one, could there be more? Possibly. Again, you're next to or formerly part of a firing range. That should have been understood in the initial handover or the initial attribution of native title. It's not like Defence suddenly created a firing range once native title was established. It had been there for decades already. And the fact Defence and the brothers that found it are still in dispute, which probably goes some way to explain why they've then gone and gone the different way. It's I don't see how this meets the criteria. So, I mean, Defence is considering the findings, but big loud dog. But cannot apply legally binding penalties. Okay, fine. You can say what you want then. No one has to listen. I don't see that banks and insurers and reputational damage and everything else. It's a long thing. It's the first ruling of its kind and set a precedent. Well, it's not binding. I mean, the lawyer can say what they want, but if it's not binding, it's, well, words on paper. If no one's there to be able to force compliance, yeah. I mean, yeah, it's a strong message. I mean, they're trying to send a strong message, and that they're trying to require the sort of due diligence. But it's no, the idea that you've got such a downstream responsibility. I don't think that that's going to work. It's like, I know Saab needs to expand its human rights assessment to take into account the potential for its weaponry to be used in the WPA and remain on Aboriginal lands. Well, I mean, you could argue then that any nation that possesses an ICBM should also do such assessments, because it's potential for an ICBM to reach all the way down to Australia and land on WPA lands. Therefore, they need to go through and undertake those assessments. It is. So, I mean, engagements with stakeholders and stuff, it's, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like there's two stories going on here, or there's two aspects to the story. One is there was the missile found, it was cleaned up, it was remediated, story done. And then there's the, well, no, we're unhappy with all of that. Let's go and find an international body or somebody who's willing to listen to our complaints that it was a human rights violation. Okay, well, I mean, the fact that there's human rights violations is not in doubt anywhere, but the question is, where? I don't see this thing. It's like accountability for the ordinance. I don't know. I mean, we know you've got to work with defence. You've got to ask them to clean up the mess. That statement is at odds with the rest of the article, with the rest of the stuff they've gone through. So, all right. Next one. All right, next article. Make myself come back. All right, we've talked in the past about other sites and other locations. I don't think that's Chinese paintwork. I mean, it might be. But anyway, let's start again. News came out last night of an incident between a Royal Australian aircraft P-8 Poseidon on patrol in the South China Sea and a Chinese fighter jet that punched out a bunch of flares in close proximity to the aircraft. Now, when we talked about the airspace incursions in Europe, that everybody's getting all upset and yelling and screaming and demanding the Russians be hung, drawn and quartered for. Well, this is how you deal with an incident like this. Not demanding what's going on in Europe, but the initial political, hey, you shouldn't have done that, as opposed to, we don't hear Australia rushing to demand China's aircraft are shot down or anything like that. I mean, China may rattle sabers as well, but so what happened was, okay, P-8 Poseidon on patrol in the South China Sea. South China Sea is obviously full of places that are contested, such as the Spratlys. Just trying to think. Henderson Shoal, I think, is one of them as well. Yeah, but basically there's a bunch of low-lying reefs and islands, and their nature and which nation claims them. Now, we talked at length about what defines territorial waters and things like that, and how you define baselines is very briefly glossed over. But talking about land permanently above the high water mark, part of the issue here is that a lot of these islands and reefs are not permanently above the high water mark. So, under the conventions for laws of the sea, they're not classed as permanent terrain. However, China has created artificial islands in some locations and plonked military bases down on them. In others, the Philippines in particular have basically put a detachment of troops aboard a shipwreck that's sitting on a reef, and using that to lay claim to territory in that regard. And then you have various navies and coast guard, and it's going at each other in generally non-violent terms, but the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippines Navy, I believe, had a clash a month or so back, where the two vessels came together at sea. The Chinese Coast Guard vessel was more heavily damaged, and I think a couple of sailors died in the incident. And I mean, this sort of stuff goes on. You see it as well. You see these sort of low-level violent clashes taking place in other locations where there's contested terrain, such as islands that both South Korea and Japan claim, places where China has claims and other nations like, no, you don't. And the idea that all this stuff's without, like, there's no conflict going over it, well, it's always been simmering. No one's shooting each other yet. But that's the concern, that at some point the tensions around these areas are going to lead to a shooting war. Now, you've got the Philippines, you've got Vietnam, you've got some places, but potentially Thailand as well, but it's a little bit out of their reach. Malaysia in some areas. But in terms of the South China Sea more specifically, the main participants, or the main people laying claim, Vietnam, Philippines, and China. Now, China's using their 9-dash line to secure claim over these reefs and islands, even though it's like, people look at it and go, no, that's you're too far from Chinese territory. Your claims are not worth it, not worth the paper they're written on. And Vietnam and Philippines though, but the problem is neither of those two countries have the military might to enforce their will in those regions. Now, it's always been, so like I said, a bunch of disagreements. Most people are in there fishing and doing whatever anyway, but it's since the Chinese have militarized a lot of these places that, all of a sudden, the rules aren't changing, but the enforceability is, and the enforcement is. And we go back to those discussions about rights of free passage and transit navigation and innocent passage and things like that. So rights of free navigation. That is why, well, the US is continually forcing it, and the same with the Formosa Strait, or the Taiwan Strait. And you've got Australia partaking in these sort of things as well, forcing their rights of free navigation through the area. Again, because if you don't use it, you lose it. And with that comes aircraft usage, and they follow the same basic rules as we discussed. So as far as Australia is concerned, they're entitled to conduct surveillance flights through this area because it's in line with international law. Quite obviously, China has a different viewpoint on that and have established various military and Coast Guard elements to support or otherwise. And so in this case, there was an Su-35 that has basically come and flown up to the Australian Poseidon and released flares in its vicinity. All right, now you come down to questions about hostile act versus hostile intent. The firing of flares in such a manner could be declared or could be determined a hostile act. It's quite obviously meant as a deterrence. It's also potentially a hostile intent. Now, if you're going to talk about procedures for air intercepts, each nation will have their own rules on that, but there are, in general, some very basic rules which are also fairly similar to intercepting vessels at sea or patrolling around them. And the idea of being able to fire flares is kind of a long way down the path, a long way down the list in the escalation levels, and sorry, a long way down the list in terms of the intercepts, and represents an escalation of what's going on. And same with the manoeuvring of intercepts and things like that. You want to keep maneuvers of the intercepting aircraft and the intercepted aircraft to a minimum so as not to upset the situation or unnecessarily antagonize things. And these things have been around for, well, decades. I mean, they were doing it all the time during the Cold War. They still do it all the time now. But it doesn't always end safely. April 2001, a US Navy EP-3 Ares, EP-32, I think, Ares. So that's an intel gathering variant of the P-3 Orion. Was doing a surveillance patrol along off Hainan Island when, and I think it was a J7, a Chinese J7 was sent out to intercept. And apparently the pilot flying the J7 at the time was one that the US Navy crew recognized. Is a fairly common sight, this particular pilot and his aircraft on intercepts in that area. So it wasn't a case of they'd not seen him before. But the US crew had sort of their doubts about this guy's aircraft handling, that he was always fairly aggressive in his maneuvers, when generally you just want, confirm what they are or who they are and encourage them to leave. And this is the US flying up and down outside the 12-mile limit. It's fairly antagonistic, but hey, they're there. They're entitled to do it. In the Hainan incident, what is believed to have happened based on the investigations and everything else, is that the J7 ended up crossing the nose of the P3, of the EP3, and hit it. And as a result, the J7 crashed and the pilot was killed, as far as I'm aware. And the EP3 suffered serious damage, to the point that they also nearly crashed, but were forced to carry out an emergency landing in Hainan. And so the Chinese now had this, well, they were quite irate. Things were very, very, very sensitive for a while. They ended up releasing or allowing the P3 to be flown out after it had been dismantled and put inside, I think it was a C5 came and picked it up. And the crew were eventually released. But yeah, there was a lot of very urgent high-level diplomacy that took place. And ultimately, whilst China were annoyed at the loss of their pilot and aircraft, fundamentally, the Chinese pilot had been in the wrong. The US aircraft was entitled to be there, and whilst China can complain about it legally, and I mean, fundamentally, you back up your complaints with military force, they weren't going to stop the US at that point. And then a few months later, something else happened and took all the focus away from those sort of events. And I mean, people were, yeah, it was a big incident there for a while. So you've come back to today. Now, it's not the first time that I knew this was going to happen. Why did I do that? All right, we should be back in. All right, so it's not the first time. I mean, we talk about being safe around things like that. I mean, naval vessels being intercepted will occasionally fire, like in the past, fired flares at aircraft on patrol and things like that. It's not the first time this sort of thing happens. In general, people are, a bit antagonistic. It's the same as looking at fire control radars and things like that. If you're going to energize a radar, an air search radar or a nav radar will generally be accepted, but a fire control radar is, no, not so much, because that's used for terminal direction or direction of weapons. And whereas an air search radar is just, filling out the picture of who's who in the zoo. So but firing flares is seen as a bit of a step up. So China's alleged that Australia illegally intruded into China's airspace. Okay, so you go back to this 9-line limit, and the fact China's now trying to enforce the airspace and water space around these artificial islands as their sovereign territory. No one else is really regarding it as such. And so China, as far as China's concerned, is like, no, you guys were in our territory. We are entitled to force you out. The rest of the world's going, it's not your territory. We have a right to be there. And so at some point, there's going to be push comes to shove, and someone's going to do something over it. Hopefully, not too much about it, but it's been a fear for decades that this region of the world is going to erupt into conflict because of the competing claims and the natural resources that go with the ability to enforce those claims. So, China's obviously getting upset about it, and Australia's responded. It's like, no. We expect everyone to be in a safe and professional manner. The fact the aircraft got intercepted, okay, that's one of those things that happens. But, I mean, this little paragraph gives it as it's a region where China's claims overlap those of the neighbours, and obviously it's a concern. Apparently, it happened previously in February, and that the same sort of claim was made then. And Australia doesn't have a territorial claim, but they're exercising their rights of access. So, it's happened previously. So, it's one of those things. We may see it happen more and more as we go forward. Sticking with military news, the change in access to the Pentagon by reporters has obviously gotten a lot of, news organizations upset. But when you look at the rules, it doesn't seem that extreme. But if you believe the media, it's the end of free speech and it's a chilling effect, and it's authoritarianism gone rampant. And it's like, well, hang on a sec. So pretty much almost all reporters have packed up and walked out of the building and because the passes were cancelled, because they refused to sign on to the new rules. Media outlets have called it censorious and disturbing. Okay, what is censorious and disturbing? The Department of War, formerly known as the US Department of Defense, formerly known as the Department of War, and I actually think that's a rebranding that's really, really smart, because it leaves people in no doubt at all what the intent of the military is for. You can't just pretend it's about rescuing puppies and kittens. No. You're there to engage in lethal violence on behalf of a nation. All right, so what do they want them to do? They want a sign-on to say that you cannot solicit information that has not been explicitly authorised for release by the government. Okay, cool. Setting aside this is the US Department of War and it's a fight between news media that thinks it's above and beyond reproach and has the ability to see and do anything. The commentary online has been fairly split. People are like, oh no, it's the death of free speech as we know it. Other people are like, this is less restrictive than would apply to any major corporate body. You can't just walk into the offices of a multinational and demand access to information like this. Why do people, or even major government agencies, so why is it the media thinks it's appropriate to demand this sort of information out of the military? And the concern, as outlined by Pete Hegseth and others, is that because this information hasn't been cleared, there's no surety that the information has been declassified appropriately or is otherwise not harmful. Well, it has a classification or limited use. And it's like, well, okay, so yes, there is a demand to have, or a need to have routine journalism, but the idea that beforehand the press were able to just waltz around the Pentagon doing whatever they wanted, it doesn't fly with how access to military sites is normally maintained. Normal people, everyday people can't go and have that sort of accessibility or freedom of access. So, I mean, the press kind of has its own special protections in some regard, but it's got to come with a bit of common sense. The idea that you need to be identified, fair enough. You've got to look at it not as an attack on the press, but from the military's point of view, of you now you want to cut down on the number of unknown, uncleared people just rifling through your state secrets. Makes sense. But, oh no, it's attacks on journalists and outlets. Well, no. What's happening is a number of outlets are being forced to pay compensation to Trump because they were caught out lying or engaging in other practices that necessitated legal action. So it's not an assault on the fundamental tenets of democracy. No, and it's not, and I mean, they're attacking Pete Hegseth over it. Okay, he had sensitive material details in a group chat. Well, the appropriateness of using such a communication channel for sharing those details aside, well, I mean, the other administrations have done very similar things, and it's like, well, okay, it seems like they're all doing roughly the same thing, or preferentially you still wouldn't be doing it. But he didn't know that somebody had included a journalist on the list. But, well, he's still the one who said it. And so they're blaming Trump and it's hostility towards the free press. No, it's just the press having a whinge about it. And so the Herald applauds those outlets which took a stand for journalism by refusing to sign up to the appalling new conditions. What? Identify yourselves? Don't go soliciting information that isn't allowed to be released? Now, if the military adhered to its rules through and through, then there wouldn't be any information leaking out. So the banishment from operating in the Pentagon is because you throw a hissy fit. You're having a tantrum because, well, the press is like, oh, we're holding the military accountable. Well, now the military is saying you need to be accountable for your own actions as well. And it's like, it's going to have an impact on reporting. Yeah, because you're having a tantrum and refusing to go and do your job properly. It's not a shift towards North Korea style information control. It's, well, no comments. Yeah. See, the media's too scared to have feedback on this. Anyway, you see, even in Australia, and I mean, they make this comment here, the press doesn't get to walk around military headquarters freely like this. They've got to be identified. They can't go and chase information. We have whistleblower laws. Now, there's supposed to be protections, but at the same time, doesn't absolve people from prosecution if laws are broken in the process of doing so. And it's no, complaining. It's the media patting itself on the back for throwing a tantrum. Really. But this idea of unnecessary access to classified information. Now, Trump was impeached, even though he had ultimate declassification authority, and the material was supplied by the National Archives, ONA, Office of National Archives, as part of his departure from the White House at the end of the first administration. It was under lock and key. Didn't stop his house being, as in Mar-a-Lago, being raided by the FBI because, oh no, he's had classified material that he shouldn't have had. Yet the same standard was not applied to Biden, who, as a senator or the vice president, did not have the same level of, well, he was not a declassification authority. As a senator, he didn't have the rights to access this material outside of a SCIF, and was supposed to have tightly controlled access to it. And as a VP, probably would have had more access, but again, shouldn't have been taking stuff back. Yet he had classified material stored in an open garage and also stored in some of the other offices that he had scattered around the place. I mean, to the same standard, he should have been impeached 2 or 3 times over. And more so because he had no legal rights to access or to have possession of that material, whereas Trump did, by virtue of having been the president. The same sort of thing goes back to the Hillary Clinton email servers, where there was compartmentalized information on them, and the suspicion that there are a number of foreign intelligence agencies that had complete access to those servers because they weren't secured very well or at all, and that it was an attempt to establish a side channel of communication for certain government peoples that was outside of the FOIA process. So freedom of information would not have been able to gain access to the information contained on the server, or that had been exchanged via the server. Now, the timings of that were considered, but at the same time, I forget the exact phrasing, but the idea that no prosecutor would prosecute Clinton for what she did. He had a whole bunch of military people suddenly go, hang on, it's a violation of National Secrets Acts, it's a violation of classified handling classified material handling. If you're an everyday person, you would have been basically sent to the brig for it. And then you had the general, who was it? One of the commanders in Afghanistan was writing a memoir, or having his mistress, as it turned out, writing his memoir for him, and he shared information with her that should never have been released. But again, was it not Clapper? It wasn't a Clapper. Someone else. But yeah, they got ahead of it. So this John Bolton case is actually very, very similar. But it's like, well, no, it's the Trump administration being authoritarian. Well, at the same time, you look at the politicization of the Department of Justice in the past. You look at what happened with, say, Roger Stone when he had his arrest, and how that was undertaken with the media and basically militarized FBI basically swamping him in his home and at super early times. And it's just a case of, well, Bolton was indicted. He didn't have, he wasn't raided like Mar-a-Lago or Roger Stone. But if you listen to what the media talks about it, it's the same level of concern, just like with James Comey. But the idea that, or the argument that the US Justice Department is completely beholden to what Trump wants to do, no, that's a false claim. I mean, it's undone the moment you look at how a lot of the actions of the Trump administration are dragged in front of the courts, mainly by Democrats, but dragged in front of the courts, get blocked, at least at one level. They wait, appeal, and once it gets overturned on appeal, because it was clearly political and there was no right of the lower court to block it, then they go ahead with what they're doing. It's the sort of thing that frustrates a lot of Trump supporters, that, well, if he was, they say that if Trump was even a fraction of the dictator or authoritarian that the left believes he is, he'd be far more effective. They wouldn't be having to deal with the problems of the courts and everything else, because they just press ahead with it anyway. Or he'd have, if he had complete control of the DOJ that people are talking about, it wouldn't be taking until now for firings to take place of certain rusted on people, or the protests of no kings and all the other things could have been shut down so much easier. There wouldn't be these protests. But the idea that, oh, no, it's he's pressuring the Justice Department to prosecute somebody who issued a death threat, somebody who manipulated the law to launch prosecution in order to get Trump listed as a felon when they've engaged in far worse behaviour, engaged in actual lawfare. But no, not enough. But that's beside the point. We're not so much focused on that. We're focused on the specifics of it. So obviously Trump's complaining about the impeachment. John Bolton, I don't think he was ever really, I don't think Trump was super friendly to him. He had him in the first administration, but people look at Bolton's role then as the attack dog on a short leash, such that when Trump went in to negotiate with a foreign nation on various things, that Bolton was the stick, and Trump could therefore offer whatever carrots he wanted, because people would look at Bolton and look at his history and realise that Trump was willing to let him off the lead, and so they'd be far more willing to negotiate. But the problem is, those sort of people can't be controlled. And so ultimately Bolton left the administration. Fair enough, when people come and go. But the concern is mishandling of classified information. Okay, so this is now treading into territory that makes a lot more sense as to why they're going after it. It's like, well, if these charges are correct, it's not politicization. I mean, he should be held to account for mishandling classified material, no matter who you are. So, does the fact that he's a Trump critic change that? No. Is it the fact that he's called him uninformed and unfit for office matter? Well, it shouldn't, because the facts or the material case brought against him is for mishandling classified material. Okay, yeah, political reasons to go after him. Yep, fair enough. And it's here. Blah, 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 blah. Prosecutors allege that Bolton improperly retained and transmitted classified information to family members using insecure means, including AOL. Some of the documents were labelled TS and presumably were compartmentalised as well. And that at one point, that information was then accessed by external parties. So it, could have been on the same level as Hillary Clinton's stuff, but I don't know. Is the timing? No, the timing's not political. It takes time. I mean, charging high-ranking officials for mishandling classified documents is rare. Well, they try to impeach Trump. They try to prevent him from running again. So, yeah. But at the end of the day, if your level within the organisation should not protect you from prosecution for an illegal act. And, I mean, there are some roles where there are certain protections for duties carried out whilst you're in that role, such as the attempts to I mean, I think it was talked about with some of the stuff Biden did and some of the stuff Trump did about official duties of actions carried out that qualified as official duties. Now, official duties gets protections. Everything else, no, you're not protected. So, okay, there's similarities. I don't think it's exactly necessarily similarities. Yep, this is talking about Biden. Yeah, he improperly stored details, but there was no charges. Whereas Trump was charged and eventually had the case dismissed. But his progressed into the courts, whereas everyone else's hasn't. So it's... Now, to win a conviction, the government must prove that Bolton knew the information... sorry, don't scroll too far. Was transmitting was classified, and he had to knowingly transfer it to someone not entitled to receive it. If you hold a national security position in an administration, I'd say you have an understanding of classified handling or classified material and what it means. Now, it's possible that some stuff might be classified after the effect, and at the time that was handled, it did not have a classification, but it should then be evident. There should be a record as to when the retroactive classification took place. So it will be, it says, well, the indictment seems to have followed the regular processes, including the rules and norms within the Department of Justice. So again, despite all the complaining and yelling and screaming about Trump being authoritarian, you go back to that article from a few weeks ago where it's like, he's authoritarian, but acting completely within the boundaries of the legal rights granted to him as the president and the administration, and everything is, at the moment, despite what everyone says, seems to be going exactly as planned. Also, not as planned, all completely within the rules. Yeah, more complaining. But we'll see how that progresses. All right, we're going to come back now. Australian stuff. We're going to focus on Victoria for a little bit. Well, I'd rather not. We had the discussions repeatedly, articles over the last few weeks about Victoria's ban on machetes and South Australia's knife ban as well. But the idea that they were going to have, well, they're going to ban, there we go, that they were going to ban machetes and have surrender boxes, all that sort of stuff, and that was going to stop crime. We had since then, in fact, we won't start with this article. I'll scroll down. We had an older one that I didn't get to at the time because, well, there's a lot of stuff being talked about. But, okay, so this article about a machete attack outside Luna Park was from 2 days ago. Look at the date on it. The 11th of October. So 10 days ago, there was more machete attacks inside a shopping centre. A brawl between two groups armed with machetes. This is after the machete ban. Okay, well, quite clearly the bad guys aren't fazed by the machete ban. I don't think anyone was necessarily injured. Okay, Vision showed several people taking swipes at each other with machetes. Groups fled the scene before the police arrived. Not clear whether anyone was injured in the incident. But you had gangs armed with machetes sorting their issues out in a public space. And the shopping centre people, everyone else is like, well, great. Okay, so did Victoria's machete ban change the outcome? No, don't think so. And it's like, well, we're investigating. And it comes back to what one of those things I was saying before, is that they're targeting almost the wrong aspect. And the idea of it being socially inappropriate to talk about more details of the gangs that are involved. Are there reasons why these gangs exist? Are there commonalities that we should be looking at? And if it's like, well, no, you can't talk about certain aspects, then what's the point of, how are you going to stop it if you're trying to say that, okay, we've taken the machetes off every Victorian, but we've still got machete attacks still. I mean, when Sydney changed their lockout laws, people in the Cross, so King's Cross, and other places where you had late night pubs and entertainment, were complaining about the loss of income. But the hospital system, people engaged in treating trauma, were like, there's been a remarkable measure of improvement since the lockout laws came into effect, that there was a drop in traumatic injuries and related items, and potentially, I can't remember if they were able to trace any sort of social aspects as well, like violence within the home and whether there were changes like that. I don't recall whether there was statistics on that. But the lockout laws certainly had an effect that was measured. Banning these machetes doesn't seem to have had an effect. 11 days after the shopping centre attack, they're fighting, another groups are fighting outside Luna Park, like not a showground, what do they call them? Well, it's a Luna Park in Sydney too, but this is the Melbourne one. Well, Luna Park. So they argued theme parks, that's the word. So they argued inside. Security removed one group. Okay, fair enough. You've separated the parties. But then they took it outside and started attacking each other with machetes. And, well, started getting injured. Well, the Premier's like, I know this is shocking behaviour. It won't be tolerated, and I think it's important to express my thoughts with the victims of the brazen and unacceptable crime. Well, what won't be tolerated? Machetes? Well, you've already banned them. This is why the ongoing work of supporting Victoria Police to get more and more of these dangerous weapons off our streets is just so important. Well, it doesn't seem to be having an effect. I mean, the ban in effect was September. These two articles are violent groups attacking each other in October with machetes. Now, we're going to take a slight detour because Victoria and crime is having a bit of an issue at the moment. There were protests last weekend. Yes, last weekend for not actually anti-immigration, immigration protests. So there were groups opposed, basically regulated migration protests, and people on the left, counter protests. The migration protests went ahead peacefully. They did as they were told. They followed the rules and everything, made it to Parliament, had their speeches, and everyone went home. What happened on the other side, though, with the counter protests, was that was significant violence launched against the police. And so the way the news and articles initially posed it was, it seemed that it was clashes between the protesters and the police got in the way of it. You read a little bit more into it, and it was not quite black bloc. It wasn't even black bloc, but there were elements within the counter protests that were there for violence and engaged the police in violence. And so it says chaos broke out when the police put up barricades to force the two groups to stay apart. Okay, fair enough. Not a police state. We have the right to demonstrate. Well, yeah, I guess. Two officers ended up in hospital after rocks, glass bottles, and spoiled fruit were thrown. The Premier's come out again and said, what happened in Melbourne yesterday, or over the weekend, was a violation of that obligation that everyone has in a democratic society, that should you choose to protest, you must do so peacefully. Well, unless you're protesting the lockdowns, in which case the police will just pepper spray your grandma. And that you can protest as long as you want, as long as you stay on the side the government wants. So, yeah, it's... So what happened yesterday wasn't just unacceptable, it violated that principle, and they shouldn't have had that level of violence perpetrated on members of Vic policing. It was just disgraceful, okay? People arrested, blah, 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 still looking for people from CCTV and body cameras, etc., blah, 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 blah. All right. We're fortunate there's only those relatively small numbers given the amount of members we had and the levels of violence that confronted them in terms of injuries sustained. It's an unsafe place for our members to be on the line. When people are hurling railway ballast at you, one of those things hits you in the head. It's a bad day for you. You may not be lucky enough to go to hospital in an ambulance. That's a deep concern for them. Fair enough. Safety. Police have defended the use of flashbangs, pepper spray, and rubber bullets to disperse the angry crowd of counter-protesters. And there is commentary that's then appeared in, I guess, leftist circles, websites that are very much leftist, kind of split. Some people are saying, well, it's like we get the right to do it. But others are saying it was a black mark. Okay, it's a black eye for leftist protest because they're saying, well, these anti-immigration protesters followed the rules and didn't get into trouble, and yet these people on our side were antagonising it. And like, the police should have got out of the way and let us punch the other protesters. And it's like, well, you get to the point of self-introspection and then go in a different direction. It's like maybe you're starting to realise that the actual political violence that's being carried out is being carried out by people that you agree with. And that maybe the message you've been selling is little more than lies. That it doesn't match up with reality, no matter how much you might wish it did. So, yeah, police could respond in appropriate force. The opposition leader claimed the protests highlights the chaos the city's been feeling. Mandatory 6-month sentence for anyone convicted of assault of police? I don't know. I'm not sure. Jacinda Ardern has attributed the ugly scenes to an escalation of bad behaviour by a minority of people who infiltrated the anti-racism protest group. If you weren't already aware which way she leans, you can get it from that statement. Majority of protests have been peaceful. Well, yeah, kind of. But yeah, so it's pushing through. Some people were arrested, got into trouble for wearing masks, even though they were directed by police to remove them so they could be identified. Well, that was also part of the issues as well. Yeah. So, I mean, so that's also part of it too. Where I scroll away from it. And so it wasn't just SBS talking about it. I mean, this is being picked up elsewhere. It was the idea that, oh no, we're going to make Melbourne a protest-free zone, or making, well, restaurant owners obviously getting upset that his businesses are being affected by it all, but the violence was an aberration and that the city's still safe. Well, she's going to say that. The Premier said the incident displayed a different pattern of behaviour to demonstrations that have been a constant weekend presence in the city. Well, only if you weren't looking. All had enough of a smaller number of people who were choosing to bring violence to our streets. Yeah, even people in the counter-protesting community were like, it wasn't all of us. There were not necessarily identifiable subgroups, but there were people there, not so much anarchists or black bloc, but there were people there to engage in violence, really. Including a ban on face masks and terrorist flags and symbols will be introduced to Parliament next month. That will be interesting. If it comes through. So, yeah, people want a temporary ban. Okay, even the opposition leaders like, no, you shouldn't ban protests, but should be given more powers to ban violent demonstrators. Yes, that's fair enough. When would it happen? And that's the problem. Once you enforce something like this, it's like the lockdowns. Once you enforce something like that, you've got to be very, very careful about how you run with it, because it's easy to vastly overstep the mark and cause issues. So, I mean, you've got the right to peaceful assembly, which covers the right to protest, and that's out of their Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. And does that, though, suppress the rights of other people who want to access the city when they're not protesting? Well, it's, yeah. So, yeah, 2 police officers were injured. And there was I'm not sure if we see it in the next article, but the anti-racism, see, and this doesn't help though either. So the anti-racism ralliers refused to condemn the violence. So the counter-protesters refused to condemn the violence while accusing police of injuring the demonstrators and facilitating anti-immigration protests. Got to have a stab in there at some point. Now these red and black flags, they're interesting. There's a couple of things that could be, but it's not a common sight for sure, and in a way it helps identify the groups of people who were there. Yeah, I think, now I'd have to double check exactly what it was, because I think, yeah, there's a couple of possible representations of what that is. Now I just got to make sure that the colours are the right way around before I misidentify the flag. Yep, protests not a problem. It's not a human rights issue. The only people that didn't have rights over the weekend were the people in uniform. Well, that's going to be the Police Secretaries Association secretary is going to say that, isn't he? At a press conference, they had a commander showing items that were being tossed at police, and now they're not in riot gear. I mean, they're wearing caps. They might have a bit of body protection on. There's some riot police further up, but you get bits of ballast or road paving and stuff tossed at you. I mean, even riot gear is not going to protect you completely from it. And I mean, even the articles I've seen were like supporting the counter protesting, and it's like, well, no, it's just, yeah, it's yeah, the organisers of the counter rally refused to condemn demonstrators who threw the rocks. All right, well, why did a police commander go out of his way to praise fascists or racist protesters, i.e. the anti-immigration protest? Well, because they did as they were told. They stayed in the area they were given permission to be in. They departed peacefully. It was a protest that didn't hurt anyone. Well, it hurt feelings. It hurt this person's feelings. But, yeah. And this person was also involved in a previous set of violent protests. So, yeah, it's, well, not really a surprise. Now, moving into broader criticism then of the Victorian government's response is, well, okay, more of what was done. This isn't so much an expansion. Yeah, 2 police officers damaged, hurt. Yep. Now, there people are starting to go, well, hang on. Well, what's happening in the rest of it? There was footage of an apparently unprovoked stabbing in the middle of Melbourne, Spencer Street. I think she got suffered a punctured lung as a result. Just completely random. That same arguments as from the other articles. Now, you can't see the names of the organisations running a bunch of these, but Workers Unite to Fight the Right. I think it's like a social SDA, I think. Not social democrats, but basically socialist parties. Obviously, imagery very much of it. There's more of those flags. So there was a bunch of protests around the country, but the Melbourne ones were largely the ones where there was violence, really. I mean, only 40 of the protesters were violent. Again, she shouldn't conflate them with peaceful protests. That's an expansion on that previous statement that was there. She's also said, yeah, so the question is, why is Victoria so different? Well, you could say a fish rots from the head, and that the reason for it is because of the way the government down there has been running things, and therefore has allowed or otherwise this sort of stuff to go on. I mean, it's one theory. One of the other articles I put up, obviously an opinion article, but it's calling Jacinda Allen's response tone deaf, and presumably it's going to be exactly the same sort of thing, but it's claiming that the Premier is, well, either deaf or blind in terms of what's been going on. Yet, again, she makes the claim that no, it's only a small number of people and this is all okay. And so the idea here is that it's a design feature of what was promoted as a counter-protest. So in other words, they were always setting out to have violence and be prepared for violence. As he says, when activists declare there's no room for racism and fascism, yet they can't define either one of those things, they're coming into the city looking for a punch-on. Now, you go back to that article from a couple of weeks ago where the anti-immigration protests were making their way to Victorian Parliament, and they had the clashes on the on the bridge, where the footage captured seemed to indicate that the protest, which had been proceeding peacefully without police protection up to that point, or without police presence, they were engaged by counter-protesters. And however, the articles thereafter said it was the anti-immigration protesters who were violent. Well, they just happened to win the fisticuffs, but ended up getting police presence from there on, and everything went peacefully. So the whole thing, like I said, people are starting to wake up and say, like, well, hang on, we keep saying it's these anti-migration protesters who are being violent, it's the right being violent, but every example that's coming forward recently is not. So what should we do about it? Or what should be done about it? Okay, the restaurant owner, them talking about it, seems like it's pulling together all those other articles. Same again. The opposition, the police association, and Jewish community groups want to permit this. Well, what about other community groups? I mean, I don't know that anti-Semitism in Victoria is that big, but at the same time, protesting what Israel was doing in Gaza doesn't amount to anti-Semitism. There are some Jewish community groups or some Jewish special interest groups that seem to take the point of view that any criticism of actions by Israel or policies and things like that is anti-Semitism. No, It's like saying that you can't criticise the actions of Julia Gillard without it becoming misogyny. Tony Abbott sort of found that he didn't negotiate that particular aspect very well when she laid into him in Parliament saying that he was being misogynistic with what he was doing. I just don't think he was prepared how to defend himself in that regard. That's going back years ago. But just because somebody has a defining characteristic doesn't mean that any criticism of what they do or say or believe is because of that, is an attack on that characteristic. No. And that's being racist or prejudicial to even suggest it. Yeah. So, okay, that's why they're involved, because there was a synagogue burnt down. So, yeah, they want to stamp out extreme and radical influences in public protests. Well, outlawing terrorist flags. Again, how do you define a terrorist flag? Some of these are going to be very interesting when people realise various groups that they support are nominal terrorist groups or have close ties. So it's, yeah. Their claim here is that the Premier needs to accept Melbourne's protest problem goes beyond a small number of demonstrators. The claim is that it is a lot more pervasive. So, yeah, there's carjackings, aggravated burglaries, domestic violence, everything's spiralling. Continued machete violence. It doesn't paint a really great tone. All right, we're progressing okay. We'll stick to Australian news for a couple more things. New South Wales housing and skills shortage. Okay, no, there's the letters to the... Yeah, we'll skip past that. But there is a question about housing policy. Okay, all problems come back to housing, and Premier puts cows as in this place. This is looking at New South Wales. There was an article, I'm just trying to think, did I cover it? No, I didn't. There was a thing about housing. No, the article was taken down. I was going to include it. There's an article saying that houses are being built faster, but still not enough. And it was tied into some Bureau of Statistics figure. But the news agency that published it took the article down when I was double checking sources this morning. So, yeah, the state's housing crisis is so pervasive it's infected all parts of public policy. Well, yeah, I guess. That he wants to limit councils standing in the way of development. Local government is an act of the state parliament. Ooh, now you talk about authoritarian statements. Now Australia has, well, in essence, three tiers of government. Commonwealth/federal, which has responsibility for things like Department of Defence. Then you have your state government, which runs things at state levels, generally education, hospitals, first responder services, or, well, they can fund them. New South Wales AMBO service, fire, all that sort of stuff. And then you have your local government, which is your council level, and that takes care of bins, connections to utilities for new development, generally managing local land usage, that sort of stuff. That's the one with the local council sort of thing. They do development approvals and whatnot. They'll follow guidance from the state level, and they'll also then follow guidance from the federal level. But by and large, if there's something that's going to impact you on a day-to-day basis, the local council is the first level you go to. So, housing. The spin on this, which I think is interesting, it's kind of how I've been pushing a bunch of things, in that you have these broader issues in society, lack of skilled workers, the inability to find accommodation or stuff, or like lack of infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. He's saying here, the Premier's saying here, that it's really housing problems. You don't have enough housing. Well, in fact, he just says skilled labour problem, cost of living, family budget problem. Well, housing in a degree. I mean, if you're spending more than a third of your income on housing and accommodation, then yes, we have a housing problem. But if the cost of living and family budget is still a problem and you're spending a third or less on accommodation, then it may not be necessarily much of a contributing factor. Now, it's obviously limiting on where people can live. Now, yes, straight up costs. 1.53 million for a median house in Sydney, 1 million in Melbourne, and there's a reason for it. But it's 8 to 10 times the median wage now. So the idea that the old rule of thumb of spending 3.5 times your income that should be what you're looking to afford. Well, if the median house price is 1.5 mil, you need a median income of 300,000 plus. Now, if you're earning $300,000 a year, even as a couple, you're in the top fraction of a couple of percent. In fact, I think you're even in the top less than 1% of Australian earners are earning in excess of $300,000 a year. So the affordability of property has decreased as that multiple leveled up. The rate of new houses coming in. Now, I don't know whether 6 per 1,000 is every year is appropriate or fast enough. I mean, it certainly seems like, with the pressures and the complaints that people are having, that no, that's nowhere near enough. Now, does that also mean apartments are included? Now, he's levelling the problems at councils, and that it's the planning system. Now, this is the same Premier that had that wonderful diagram, that piece of paper is waving around, peace in our time. No, wait, change the planning in our time. Saying that he was going to cut regulation and expedite the planning processes to make it a lot more sensible. Well, somewhat sensible. And so, yep, passed last week from the government, so passed Parliament, and so that we'll see the ability to fast-track things. Now, is this just going to move the problem somewhere else? General rule of thumb is, if you see a group or a body established to nominally expedite things, it's going to result in, well, people exploiting the system at some point. So a 3-person housing delivery authority that has the power to set significant developments on a fast track, bypassing local councils, that's going to attract pressure, financial, legal. It's going to be interesting to see how it works. I mean, it's a good idea on paper, but I think it fails to take into account people. And there's lots of things out there that you go, well, this was a fantastic idea on paper and it's a fantastic concept. It was just let down by people, because people are people. And if you don't take into account what people are like, yeah, whatever your design and development plan is not going to work properly. So, yeah, I mean, 377,000 new homes by 2029. Okay, so that's what they're saying, that they're only delivering 6 per 1,000 people. Now, there's what, 5? Let's just go for a basic figure of 5 million people in New South Wales. It's more than that. So that's 6. So 1,000 people to a million is 1,000. So that's 6,000 houses per million people. We said there were 5 million. So that's 30,000 houses for the state per year. So 30,000 for the state per year. And he wants to get this done by 2029. So 4 years away, 5 years away. Only half those at the current rate, at 6 per 1,000, less than half are going to be delivered. Now, the population is more than 5 million, so the figure will actually be a little bit more, but I think they're going to struggle to hit that target. And, well, is it going to affect the next election? Possibly. So they're pushing through and, well, authoritarian to some degree. So it's been convenient to use councils in the past, but in Wallara they announced that they're going to go ahead with it, even though it will be unanimously opposed by council, but they're going to put in a train station and 10,000 houses. The government knows best. And the idea that the government is just an act of the state parliament. And see, this is the weird thing I'm seeing, is that the media, even these media sources that we're looking at, all have a inherent bias. And by and large, Australian media, outside of a very narrow selection of sources, has a left-leaning bias. And the government in New South Wales, I'm almost certain, is Labor-led now. Well, let's have a look. Chris Minns is the Australian politician, 47th and current Premier of New South Wales, leader of the New South Wales branch of the Australian Labor Party. What a surprise. Now, the cynic in me saw that statement and went, I can't see the Liberals or the Coalition saying something like that. I mean, they're believed to be far more business sensitive, far more supportive of business and things like that. But I don't think the Conservative Party would have made a statement like this, that local government is just an act of state parliament, i.e. we tell you what to do and you do as you're told. Or we're going to force things on you, even though it's universally or unanimously opposed, because we're the government and we know what's right. Or we know what's good for you. Even better, we have eminent domain over their decisions. In all the articles crying and screaming about creeping authoritarianism, they've targeted Conservatives. Oh, we've been rolling over the top of them for the last 2 years, and now we're about to formalise it. Now, I mean, okay, the idea of at some point you got to bite the bullet and force some things down people's throats in order to get these housing developments underway or to increase density and things like that. At some point, that's got to happen. But you don't push it like that. That just sends a shiver down my spine, to be honest. Now, the fact it is Liberal controlled, no, it's not politicsing at all. Whether they're going to take legal action, I don't know though. I mean, ICAC is fairly active in New South Wales, but I don't know that you're going to be able to stop it. the idea that they want to, suggestion to convert Long Bay Jail into new housing has been rejected. What, do they want to reopen it? I don't know. So yeah, just lack of housing, not enough housing. There should be no area of Sydney immune from more density. Yep, no, fair enough. You want to tell a working class suburb they have to wear the hurt and have more density? Guess what? The rich suburbs do too. If everyone's doing a bit, there's more equity. Okay, that's a very socialist view on things. Yeah. The articles, is this the one I was looking at? There was maybe this one? No, the comments generally are left-leaning as well. No, it's the next set of articles that we're going to look at. Yeah. More housing supply. Yep, okay. Planning controls are too conservative and restrictive. Demand versus supply. So 8,000 plus additional people arriving every week. Obviously not enough houses being built, but no, it's racist to say that you've got issues when things like that happen. Housing policy is failing despite giving developers free rein. Threatens councils who are waiting for DA submissions, and it's just sweeping away levels of government is an excellent idea. No, consolidation of power. It feels like our state government has declared war on us. Not so much for the housing society, the housing issues. It's just we could get rid of the New South Wales level of parliament and convert that into a housing estate. Yeah, no, they'll never agree to that. It's just it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I don't know that it's necessarily gonna go that way. All right, we've covered that stuff. Okay, not much to go now. We're going to cover some stuff to do with, Ukraine and Russia. First article. The first article that came up was from a couple of days ago. And I wasn't aware that they'd actually arrested somebody in relation to the Nord Stream underwater blast and destruction of the pipeline, and that it was in Poland. Now, the article here is talking about the conclusion of the court case, where the Polish judge has refused to extradite a Ukrainian citizen to Germany. So Germany wanted him. He was detained in Poland last month on a European arrest warrant. The judge argued that if Ukraine was responsible for the attack, then it was a just act. That has far more reaching impact than I think most people are aware. That this judge has basically arbitrarily decided that violent action or destruction of infrastructure outside of the territory that is currently being fought over is not only militarily okay or permitted, that such destruction is permitted and can be done by agents, agents as in individuals or groups that are not necessarily defined belligerents, and they're not necessarily uniformed or clearly defined combatants, but that it is a just act. Now, coming out of Poland, this is a bit weird, and I don't know if there's going to be a follow-up from that. And so the accusation, or the suspect, was that he planted explosives below the Baltic Sea on the pipelines on Nord Stream. The blame from the blasts initially focused on Moscow until signs of Ukrainian involvement began to emerge. Only if you were a blind reporter. Those details were immediately aware. There was... if you were ignorant of what was going on, fair enough, you may not have known, but the media was like, Russia's fault. But it failed the smell test. There was so many holes in that argument. It's just like, why are you selling us this? But yeah, Ukraine has repeatedly denied any role. The Polish Prime Minister said the ruling was right. Case closed. Oh, Poland's getting themselves set up for things. Okay, long and passionate speech. So obviously, he's made it political. Considering only said he was considering only the request to send the suspect to Germany, not the substance of the case itself. But he was clear that the context of the war in Ukraine was critical. So, come back to his statement of, oh no, if Ukraine was responsible, it was just. I was only considering the request to send him to Germany, not the substance of the case itself, but the context was critical. Well, those two statements don't go together. Russia's invasion is a bloody and genocidal attack. Well, gee, I wonder which way he goes. Ukraine had the legal right to defend itself. Well, based on his own arguments, this judge is now a legitimate target because he's stopped prosecution of the destruction of the pipeline. He just said that the destruction of the pipeline was a just act. So, therefore, anybody who's involved around it being targeted is also a just act. If Ukraine and its special forces organised an armed mission to destroy enemy pipelines, which the court does not prejudge, you did, then these actions were not unlawful. They are. Because the whole reason there are ICC warrants out for Russian military leaders at the moment is because of attacks on infrastructure in Ukraine. That's it, for targeting infrastructure. So this Polish judge has basically self-inserted himself and said, it's not a war crime if we do it. No, it's just collateral damage. On the contrary, they were justified, rational, and just. Yeah, this guy's going to see his statements reappear. If the ICC cases ever proceed, they're going to be quoted right back at him. He's undermining the legitimacy of the warrants issued on behalf of the ICC. Well, I think people who think critically about it would have argued that the ICC warrants were unjust to begin with. But to then have these statements come out, well, it just validates that viewpoint that the ICC warrants are inadmissible, that they've been politicised weapon, and that the ICC is not standing up for the morals or the goals it was designed for. So, anyway, I think this Polish judge has shot himself and many other people in the foot. Deprive the Russians of billions of euros. What could be seen as terrorism or sabotage in peacetime was different in a time of war. Well, down here is not a conflict zone. The map's over the top. The conflict zone is down here, not over here. So Germany had in fact halted use of the two Nord Stream pipelines. Poland had always been a vote. Okay. Now there's secondary concerns, which is Poland was suffering an economic loss because of the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, the whole Nord Stream pipelines through the Baltic, Poland has been a vocal critic for making Berlin too dependent on Moscow, whatever. The route through the Baltic deprived Poland of transit fees for the gas. Ukraine and the US are also long-standing, Ukraine. So there used to be, or there were, the pipelines out of Russia used to run through Eastern Europe, through Poland and everyone else to Germany. And so these nations that had the pipelines running through them would get a transit fee. Ukraine would also tap off the gas as well. And part of the justification, that wasn't in the casus belli, but people believed there to be part of the justification that Putin was using to invade Ukraine, was that Ukraine weren't paying their bills. They were effectively in default on their payment for the gas that they kept taking out of the pipelines. And so Russia was part of the reason they built the Nord Stream, was to avoid that sort of situation. It's part of the reason why people say that there was the civil war in Syria, why the US and other nations were so supportive of certain groups, was because there was going to be a new pipeline coming out of the Middle East that was going to go through Syria and Turkey, or was going to go through Turkey. They were trying to prevent the use of pipelines that they didn't have a control over or didn't have access to. And so, whilst it might have nominally been about the freedom of the Syrian people from Bashar al-Assad's rule, there were other motives at play, such as the distribution of natural resources and who gets to have transit rights for them. So the judge also questioned whether Germany had jurisdiction to even bring the case, as explosions were in international waters. Well, not quite. These EEZs, yeah, I mean, maybe outside the 12-mile limit, but on pipelines with majority Russian state ownership. Okay, the Ukrainian would also get compensation from the Polish state for having been arrested. I'm happy it was a very hard 3 weeks. Really? You're not helping your case here. The Ukrainian guy's wife said, "For me as Ukrainian, it was very important to hear that he understands us. The family plan to stay in Poland where they have lived since February 2022. Huh. Earlier, she described her husband's arrest at their home outside Warsaw and said he denied any involvement in the sabotage. He is a deep-sea diver, but it is a hobby and said he had no military role. I can understand why the guy was arrested now, and no, he has a business in Poland installing air conditioners. Every little snippet of information just makes it seem more and more like he's, yeah. His wife could not tell the BBC exactly where her husband was when 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, because she said no one had asked her. He's not the only suspect on Germany's list. There's another Ukrainian man. He's in jail in Italy at the moment, and is currently appealing to... Whilst he was ruled that he should be extradited to Germany, the verdict was annulled by the top appeals court, and the case has been returned to start again. Asked about the decision, Germany's foreign minister said, "Respect of the ruling, not the job of the government to interfere with the courts." Whilst, okay, they've gone ahead and done it, I've got a feeling this Muppet and the one back here, the judge, are setting a bad precedent. Really. It's going to give legitimacy to the actions outside of the conflict zone, and attempts to abrogate international war crimes conventions and things like that. It's just, the arguments put forward in the article, I don't think are very good. And that, yeah, it legitimizes, it sets that precedent that actions against elements outside of the conflict zone are a just act. Well, okay, let's take that as okay. Let's take it at face value that that's the case. So the conflict zone down here, that means Russia can destroy the military hardware that the NATO forces, various NATO countries, are supplying to Ukraine, but they can reach out and destroy them in the countries that they're originating from. So rather than waiting for them to arrive at railheads or bases in Ukraine, they can destroy them in situ in the countries they're coming from. Because according to this Polish judge, what is terrorism or sabotage in peacetime is different in a time of war, and that these sort of actions are just acts. Yeah. See? That's the problem. You might agree ideologically with something or not, but you've got to think about the longer term, broader effects of the decisions you've made. Now, this came down like really recently, is that Zelensky's ready to join the Trump-Putin talks after Frank White House meeting. So the meeting earlier in the week when Zelensky arrived had discussions at the White House. There was stuff initially suggesting that, oh, well, he kept pushing for Tomahawks, saying he's going to give the US drones and train the US how to use drones as long as he gave them Tomahawks. Well, for a start, that sounds like someone's reaching and is actually hurting for material. It's not a position of a strong negotiation, really. There was also a bit more stuff. Now, outside of this, and we will look at what Trump had said as well, it seemed the rhetoric of the last couple of weeks of, oh, we might give them Tomahawks, or we might do this, or we might do that, or that Ukraine is going to curb stomp Russia and get everything back and everything else. That narrative has shifted. And the question was where Trump was getting that information from, or who he was listening to. Now, obviously, there's plenty of people out there who believe that. But the question is, what evidence was Trump looking at to support that claim? If he had evidence, then ultimately that would come to light. So, in due course, either significant military capability added to Ukraine, or mass numbers of bodies, or something would change and change on the battlefield. It's not the sort of thing you're going to hold in reserve of Ukraine thinking it can push Russia out completely. They're not going to sit on that. They're going to use it. So whatever Trump was looking at to make those statements, or whatever he's basing those statements off, if that information was not public, it would become public in due course. Maybe not from the US, but we'd see the change on the battlefield, or we'd see change in the conflict in some way, and we could then trace that back and go, okay, well, that's what Trump was referring to when he made those statements. The concern, though, was that anybody who was not so much slightly critical, who really looked closely at what was going on and wasn't a blind advocate for either side, was scratching their head about what Trump was referring to. Now, the Flamingo medium-range / long-range cruise missile that Ukraine is building might have the capability to deliver on some of that stuff, but the problem is their production pipeline is very constrained. They can't build enough of them. They're unable to field enough of them on the battlefield or from launch sites to have to be the hinge factor that they want it to be. And the same probably would come down with the Tomahawks as well. If they were to be fielded in sufficient numbers to have the effect that Ukraine wants, as Trump points out, he'd have none left. And US needs them. So he's not going to give them all to Ukraine. And Russia also rightly points out that they have countermeasures that they're not using, but they will use. And they will take actions to mitigate the effect of these arriving in theatre, which is fair and true based on what people know about the makeup of military forces, Russian military forces. The effectiveness, no? Well, but then again, no one really knows because it's not come up against it. You go back to those articles that we looked at a couple of weeks ago or last week where people were talking about the the arms manufacturing within Russia and the fact that they're actually a net exporter of armaments at the moment. So they've been in a war for the last 3 years, one that we've been told constantly that Russia is on the edge of collapse, that they've run out of hardware, they've run out of people, they've run out of money and everything else. That is contrary to the article saying, well, Russia's arms industry is exporting actively to various nations. They've ramped up particularly drone manufacturing capacity. G'day, Bean Peony. Which ceasefire? Are we talking about the one in Gaza? I don't have an article on that one today, actually. But my thoughts on that, we're going to take a little sidestep here and answer a question from chat. What I've read, and so all I can go off is what I've read, is that there was a small-scale Hamas attack. It killed 2 Israelis, 2 IDF members, and Israel bombed the crap out of them in response. Question being, who started it? And what I read implies that it was Hamas starting it, and Israel had previously warned them not to approach. I don't know if it was specifically in that location, but in general told Hamas, don't approach our lines. Well, Hamas did it anyway. Who engaged who first? I don't 100% know. Reading what I've read suggests it was Hamas engaging the Israeli position first and killing 2 IDF members. Now, it's also entirely possible Israel gave warnings and then fired on the Hamas fighters, who then returned fire. I mean, either way, it's a point of contention. There were dead, well, at least dead on the Israeli side. I'm not sure if they killed the Hamas fighters. And the next level of bombing, okay, might be a little bit excessive, but I get the feeling that the ceasefire has resumed. Well, that was the same thing with Iran. So for those who didn't see the comment was from the commenter, they believe that before it got out, when the ceasefire was just announced, the IDF killed people the day before, so Hamas could have been retaliating to that, which did not get much coverage. All right, so that's a fair comment too. Yes, there were bullets and bombs flying right up to the ceasefire time. And if you look at what happened with Iran, that was happening there as well. There were missiles in flight right up to the time of the ceasefire. And we go back to articles from a couple of weeks ago, before Trump made his 20-point plan, so before the UN General Assembly, around the time that Israel bombed Qatar. And the comments I made at the time was that Israel were rapidly using up, or had used up, any goodwill that remained after them basically bringing Iran back into line. Because there's a lot of nations there in the Middle East that do not like Iran, and were quite happy for Israel to give them a bloody nose and bring them into line. And so there was goodwill that existed, and people sort of looked the other way for a little bit. But Israel then going and bombing Qatar certainly burnt all of that. Israel attacking Yemen, I think, again, most Middle East nations are kind of okay with it. The Saudis definitely are, because the Houthis have fired scuds into Saudi. I know the UAE is in favour of it too, because, again, they've had issues with the Houthis as well. So these nations are like, Israel wants to punch the Houthis, go right ahead. A lot of those nations also have, to be honest, very little love for the Palestinians. And so the fact that they're seeing Israel and Palestine fighting it out, well, it just means Israel's not focusing on them. The whole Israel firing right up to the ceasefire, I think that is Israel basically doing what they want. And one of the concerns was, or what we saw with the Iran thing, was there was a couple of times where Trump seemed to have Netanyahu restrained a couple of times. He basically stopped him from acting. And I don't recall really any other time that anyone's told the Israelis to stop doing something, and they stopped. Yet all these other actions seem to be like, we're just going to carry on doing what we want anyway. The whole everyone firing at each other right up to the ceasefire time, yeah, well, that's just the way they do it. I don't think, though, that this was retaliation in that regard. Hamas is facing an existential crisis right now, because not only are they being directed to disarm and dismantle as part of the 20-point plan, but they're now facing actual resistance, actual bloody resistance within the Gaza Strip. Now, when Hamas were initially elected into power, and they were elected into power back in the day, they purged the Gaza Strip of the Palestinian Authority and anybody else that opposed them. There were so many public executions over the years. Like, Hamas have ruled the Gaza Strip with an iron fist. And so these public executions and stuff that are going on now is Hamas returning to be what Hamas did in terms of managing the Gaza Strip. And the horror that a lot of Western protesters are seeing is because they never really paid attention. And because, well, news like that coming out of Gaza, no one really cared about, which is sad. But the idea that you've had this force that has enforced its will on the people through violence, yeah, they've got the charter to get rid of Israel, but they've also been getting rid of the Palestinian people as well. They're extraordinarily violent towards their own people. No, not as in their own people being Hamas, but the Palestinian people living in Gaza. And the fact that you've got all these other sects and tribes and everything else suddenly fighting back. Yeah, there's allegations that Israel's funding some of these, and other Middle East nations are funneling money and weapons into these groups, because somebody's going to have to come in and take over the power vacuum. And so this initial burst of violence, I think, is Hamas trying to re-establish itself as the authority. And, well, they do that through violence. Israel, I think, had the high ground to say the ceasefire is ending when when not all of the hostages were returned, being it the remains or otherwise. The actions that they're taking to dig up under Khan Yunis, I think that's the right place, where they've sent the bulldozers in, implies that, yep, they were holding the hostages in underground tunnels and everything else. And so that question then goes, did that legitimize the bombing that Israel was undertaking? Because, well, they're hitting the Hamas sites, and the Hamas sites are buried. The fact there's a civilian building over the top, well, everyone cries and screams and says, war crime, crime against humanity. Well, under the conventions, you are permitted to hit a civilian target if it's basically, if a military target can't be separated from it. You can't hide military targets into and under and around civilian assets. When they took out Nasrallah in Lebanon, they basically demolished it's like a 6 or 7 story apartment block above the bunker. Well, that's where the bunker was. Take the bunker out. Have to get through the apartment building first. Now, they didn't end up destroying everything else. It was a fairly precise strike. But at the end of the day, they had to destroy an apartment building in order to get at the bunker underneath. People tend to have blinkers on when it comes to this sort of stuff. And then when you look at all the people that have returned and stuff like that, so far, it looks like they're acting in good faith. So far. And are willing to wait for the remaining remains to be returned. The sticking point going forward, I believe, in terms of achieving the remaining 20 points, or the remaining however many points are left, is Hamas. Like, the thing Trump did, which I think has the greatest chance of achieving success, was getting the other Islamic nations, so not just the Middle East nations, but Islamic dominant nations such as, say, Indonesia, clearly not part of the Middle East, but the world's most populous Islamic nation, is bringing those nations in to provide support for the peace plan, which is basically eroding support that Hamas had or have. And so what you have now is an armed group of radicals who are facing an existential crisis, and, well, their support infrastructure has been taken out from them. They're cornered. You can see them potentially lashing out, and not just at their own people, because they've got no other choice. They're going to be removed one way or another. Now, Trump's hoping it's peaceful. I'm holding out hope too. In part because the approach being taken is, well, kind of unique. But also, it really does seem like there's solid progress. Well, we'll keep fingers and toes crossed, and hopefully that'll go ahead. All right, let's get back to the Ukrainian stuff. Okay, so yeah, coming out of the meeting earlier in the week, there's a lot of stuff about TLAMs and everything else. It didn't seem, at least not in the reporting I saw, it didn't seem that there was a lot of confrontationalism in the meeting Zelensky had when he was at the White House. It seemed to be relatively straightforward. No one was telling him, thou shalt give up everything. It just seemed to be a continuation of it. I mean, if anything, it was Zelensky trying to push for more money, more weapons and TLAMs and stuff. I mean, some people are getting a bit sick of his constant grifting, but it makes sense that he'd be there asking for that sort of stuff. Putin calling Trump, and apparently it was that way around. Some people are saying it's because of the threat of TLAMs. Maybe. There is also a suggestion out there that it was Putin basically ringing up Trump and saying, look, here's the way the world works. You sell those or you give those to Ukraine and they use them. This is what we're going to use in response. And Trump going, backing down. Because the tone on him willing to give TLAMs to Ukraine or used in the conflict changed after his conversation with Putin. So I'm guessing Putin either pulled back the curtain a little bit and said, you see this stuff? We're going to use it. And Trump was like, okay, bluff has been called. Or there was some other aspect to that call. Now, it may have been also Putin's just gone, okay, we're going to accept this and that, this and that. We'll jump to, again, the meat of what Trump had to say about it. But the idea that now Zelensky, if it's an invitation in a format where we meet as three, or as it's called, a shuttle diplomacy, we will agree. So this then raises the question. You've got to look at what's not being said or why it's happening. Previously, all right, so wind the clock all the way back to 2022. There were peace talks planned for or scheduled in Istanbul early 2022, and most people, in hindsight, believe that that was the best chance for peace. It is also believed that the emergency diplomacy from Boris Johnson, former British Prime Minister, was what convinced Zelensky not to agree to peace at that time. And then subsequently the SBU took out one of their own negotiators, blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, that killing of the negotiator, extrajudicial killing by the SBU of one of their own negotiators, I think was more of a message to Putin that peace wasn't going to happen, irrespective of what was put on the table. All right, so we now move forward, people not really wanting to sit down and talk. Putin, in his sit-downs with Trump in Alaska, and also what he said openly about, look, this is what we want to achieve or anything, fundamentally has the upper hand. I don't care what people think or claim otherwise. He fundamentally has the upper hand. Possession, 9/10 of the law. Crimea is going to stay Russian. The occupied zones of Luhansk and Donetsk are going to stay Russian. If you look at how the battlefields have evolved and what they've then done in the occupied zones, there is, short of all of NATO taking to the battlefield, and even then, it's not a guarantee, the Russians aren't being dislodged. The Russians also held elections in those occupied regions, and they all voted to switch to Russia. Okay, now it can be disputed how free those elections were. Certainly as free as the ones in Moldova, and everyone celebrated those because they went the way of the EU. Certainly as free as the ones in Romania, that they then redid 3 times until they got the result the EU wanted. So there's no clean hands in any of this. But the elections were held, and they were as legitimate as the outcome from Euromade. And ultimately, if we go back to 2014, I mean, you can go back to 1991 if you really want to, but if the outcome of Euromade, let's just speculate here, obviously it went EU away from Russia, fair enough, not a problem, politics swings back and forth, but had there been a more of a conciliatory approach at that time from Kiev and the western oblasts to Luhansk, Donetsk, and even what's the southern city they haven't taken yet? Odessa. That we probably wouldn't have seen conflict had they accepted that there are regions of Ukraine that are not in favour of the EU, that have very strong cultural and historical ties to Russia. Then maybe there wouldn't have been the conflict initially, that people would have negotiated a settlement of, okay, look, you guys don't have to agree with how the Euromaidens turned out. Euromaidens just seemed to be focused on well, whatever people want in Kiev is good for the whole country, or from those Western Oblasts is good for the whole country. When the idea of Ukraine as this single amorphous blob doesn't ring true. It's like the people who looked at Iraq and Afghanistan as single nations, when ultimately they're held together multiple different tribes and things like this. And once you take the government away, warlords emerge, and you have all these other problems of tribal conflict and sectarian violence and all the other bits and pieces. It's part of the reason Yugoslavia fell apart, and Croatia and everyone else suddenly emerged, and Bosnia and Kosovo and all those other places. I mean, Yugoslavia were these disparate peoples being held together in a single nation of sorts up to that point. Ukraine has a similar sort of thing. I mean, even the Western Oblast is territory taken from Poland. And no one's rushing to tell Ukraine to give it back to the Poles. So the idea that these Eastern Oblasts and Crimea were going to always go along with a heavily EU swing from Kiev, no. But at the same time, I don't recall there being much of a conciliatory approach. It was a case of, we in Kiev have decided we're doing this, it's going to go this way. And you saw riots in Odessa. You saw deaths out of the trade unions building. You saw problems coming out of, well, obviously, Donetsk and Luhansk got turned into conflict. They went, nope, we're not going to buy in on it. You guys achieved it at the point of a gun. We're going to achieve it at the point of a gun. And then over time, because they couldn't find a peaceful outcome, and in essence, Ukraine looked like it was, the rest of Ukraine was trying to curb stomp Luhansk and Donetsk, blah, 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 blah. Days go by. Russia eventually goes, you can't attempt to genocide, ethnically cleanse ethnic Russian people like that. And then eventually Putin goes, right, that's it, we're coming in to fix it. Okay, long story short, that's where we are. And so, up until now, well, particularly post-February 2022, all you've heard from Zelensky is chest beating. He's strutting around like a pigeon playing chess. And the problem being is that a lot of the rest of Russia, a lot of the rest of Europe, never liked Ukraine to begin with. It was always seen as corrupt, people trafficking problems, very, very, very problematic. But it was one of those things that people willingly forgot. And the same thing too, Russia was normalizing relations with a lot of Europe up to that point. Which is also why I think the MH17 outcome, I don't think is completely accurate either. Because how it's played into certain things, yeah. I do think Russia has the TEL, that launched the missile. Who launched the missile, though? I think is still factually murky. Because both sides have heavily invested to only share the facts that support their point of view. All right. Okay, I didn't hear the media report saying that it was going to be a shouting match. And it certainly didn't look like there was issues coming out of it. But, yep, there's still large areas of disagreement, quite clearly. Zelensky was guarded. He said the meeting was frank. Well, okay, well, maybe that means there was the Trump being stole. Told Trump that his main aim was a just peace, not a quick peace. Well, he criticised Hungary as the location. Now, look, if you want both parties there, if you want Putin there, and you're going to pick a place in Europe, Hungary and Serbia are about it. Unless you're going to go into Belarus, you're pretty much stuck. And given the yelling and screaming that various politicians are saying, there's no guarantee that Putin has got safe passage or will leave again. So the idea that Hungary, okay, they're part of the EU. Zelensky might cry about it because they're aligned with Russia, but as a neutral site or a near neutral site, you can't get much better, to be honest. Um, saying that Hungary could not do anything positive for Ukrainians or even provide a balanced contribution. So just because Orban doesn't want to be heavily involved in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, well, okay, yeah, Zelensky's going to tell him say that it's not appropriate. I think Zelensky's going to be finding out very quickly what people actually think. Trump wants to make it comfortable for everybody. It would be, yes, leaders, they will have to get together at some point. Lavrov, now I said this previously as well, this guy is the one to keep an eye out for when Putin eventually steps down or is no longer in power. I don't know that he's being groomed for the job, but he certainly seems to be in position for it. Yep, they had a constructive phone call on preparations. Yeah, Zelensky had won the Tomahawks, but yeah, walked away empty-handed. I think that was based on the Putin-Trump call. Which means Zelensky probably came in under the misconception he was getting TLAMs, which I don't know how he got that idea. I mean, Trump was talking about things, but yeah, I think a lot of people are like, yeah, that's not happening. That's not happening. Now, you can believe the media if you want, but people with their heads screwed on were like, yep, nope, unlikely to go ahead. Trump had warned Zelensky that Putin would destroy Ukraine if he didn't agree to its terms. I don't know about that. Again, Russia doesn't have the interest, doesn't want Kiev. US side was said to have echoed Russian talking points at the volatile meeting. No. Reported that Trump tossed aside maps of the front line of Ukraine and insisted Zelensky surrender the entire eastern Donbass to Putin. Now, this comes into this other article, which we're going to look at, which is Trump wrote in social media shortly after the meeting that Russia and Ukraine should stop where they are, referring to the current vast front line. Let both claim victory, let history decide. Yeah, I think Russia's going to come out of it better. As much as it pains people to hear that. I mean, it's like you look at Cyprus and how Turkey's looked at for having invaded and everything else. Zelensky reacted by saying he's ready for an immediate ceasefire, insisted Ukraine will not gift anything to the aggressor. Again, depends on how you define aggressor. Putin's spokesperson said that Russia's position was unchanged without giving any further details. Now, Russia's claim is we'll take the terrain currently held, and that's it. I mean, and that Ukraine doesn't join NATO or the EU, doesn't join NATO, and NATO stops its arming of them, etc. And that also Russia doesn't want neutral troops there to observe. No, that's it. It's going to be where they are, and basically that's it, which is fair enough. So yeah, I don't know that they want. Well, I mean, I think they wouldn't mind the entire Donbass, but yeah. Kiev, Venezuela saying the demands are tantamount to a de facto capitulation. Guess what? Because it is. Well, not quite. Blah, blah, blah. 20% blah doesn't. Okay. Trump. Yeah, I don't think Trump is fully and completely on Putin's side. He's not. Trump is on Trump's side. He wants to see a peace. And I think, and I've thought this for a while, I think he sees the balance of power where it is, and that concessions have to be made. Now, I don't know, again, I don't know where he was getting the whole Ukraine can throw Russia out completely, because this appears to be like a 180 in his previous statements. And it's like, well, what's happened? Well, what's happened in between is a phone call from Putin and the fact that someone is now actually applying pressure to Zelensky. Because it seems like no one's applied pressure to him in any way, shape, or form. Everyone's quite happily given him money and arms and everything else. SBU, yeah, right. And see, the SBU is interesting. So if Zelensky ever was removed from power, I'd be more concerned about the SBU, what they may do, and also that they'd probably step in to control the power vacuum somehow. Yeah, I don't know how much of a free and fair elections we're going to see again in Ukraine in the near future. So yeah, not Disneyland, not kindergarten, major shift in positions. Yep. So yeah, he said that back then it could win all of Ukraine in its original form after getting to know and fully understand the positions and the economic situation. However, it's changed. Even on Monday, Trump said Ukraine could still win it. However, I don't think they will. And that, yep, Ukraine will likely have to give up some territory. Zelensky is constantly rejected. Well, Zelensky can say what he wants, but it's not going to change the reality of what's on the ground. The attempt to continue to pressure Russia, but again, Russia's arms industry and stuff, yeah, I also think it's that part of the fact like Brazil and India and China continue to buy Russian oil. The attempt to sanction Russia into compliance, well, I don't think Russia was exporting that much to those nations sanctioning them. Well, maybe gas to Europe, but they found other buyers. So the net overall effect is more of damage to the nations during the sanctions, because they've cut off a big part of their hydrocarbon supply. They've cut off their winter heating supplies. And now they've got to find other sources that aren't as readily available or aren't as easy to acquire. And so there's this idea that the sanctions have actually bitten the nations imposing them more than it has Russia, because the nature of the Russian economy isn't the same as Western economies. So, yeah. So we will look at two more articles before we finish up. This one, though, is the article about where Trump came out 2 days ago, a day and a bit ago. Yep. Go away. That the Donbass region of Ukraine should be cut up, leaving most of it in Russian hands to end a war that has dragged on for nearly 4 years. A couple of months away. Let it be cut the way it is, he told reporters. It's cut up right now, adding, you can leave it the way it is right now. They can negotiate something later on down the line, he said, but for now, both sides of the conflict should stop at the battle line. Go home, stop fighting, stop killing people. Fair enough. I mean, that makes reasonably good sense. And I think that, that's what I felt the eventual ceasefire / peace line is going to be. The latest comments come after Ukrainian drones struck a major gas processing plant in southern Russia, forcing it to suspend its intake of gas from Kazakhstan, Russian and Kazakh authorities said. He's edged back in the direction of pressing Ukraine to give up and retaking land it's lost to Russia. I got a feeling Russia's pointed out some of its air defense systems that it's going to start ramping up. That's my spin on things. Whether Russian President Vladimir Putin would be opening the war without taking significant property from Ukraine. Trump responded, well, he's going to take something. Yep, okay, so again, the front lines haven't really shifted. It says Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think this... Yeah, ISW. Okay. ISW have been little more than propagandists, really, to be honest. Their stuff looks good, but they keep spewing the same sort of stuff time and time again when the reaction on the ground doesn't seem to match up. So the idea that this was always going to be Russian-held territory, down here, okay, I could see, yep, that was a actual counteroffensive. In and around Kharkiv, maybe. But Sumy and into Kiev, etc., I don't think Russia ever had the interest. It was a feint to consolidate this area and also to pressure Putin to the negotiating table. They were always planned to withdraw and hold these regions. Partisan warfare, well, again, that depends on how you define it. I think that boundary is pretty right. I mean, it's along the river, mainly. It also means that Russia has the... I'm pretty sure it's down here. The nuclear power plant that's down here as well. Plus they've got all the steel works and coal mines and everything else. Trump says, we're the only nation that goes in, wins a war, then leaves. No, you're not. You didn't win Vietnam. You left. Somalia wasn't a win, to be honest. Iraq, you could argue, wasn't necessarily a win, but there were troops on the ground there for a lot longer than, well, a lot of people wanted. Afghanistan, I don't think many people are regarding that as a win. Europe, well, there's still US boots on ground and bases in Europe. I don't know of too many places where you could make that claim legitimately that the US has won a war and left completely. I mean, even if you look at Afghanistan, Trump's talking about getting Bagram Air Base back. I mean, most of the combat troops will be removed, but there's still going to be military bases. So the meetings, they're saying that the meetings with Zelensky were tense. Yeah, Trump doesn't look too happy in that photo, and Zelensky, that looks like a forced expression as well. Saying that he pushed Zelensky to give up swaths of territory. Okay, so it lines up with the other article. Did not commit to providing with TLAMs, and, well, what security guarantees are going to be? That's going to be it. Okay, well, it sounds like yet more negative feedback. Your country will freeze and your country will be destroyed if Ukraine doesn't make a deal with Russia. Yeah, well, Russia's successfully hitting power distribution networks. They're not supplying gas anymore. In fact, I think they were actually, early on in the conflict, still supplying gas to Ukraine. But, well, they got every right to turn the taps off, thanks to the Polish judge. It's not a case of targeting the civilian population of Ukraine. It just so happens that they're going to suffer as a result of the infrastructure being targeted. Zelensky continues his line of he won't voluntarily cede any territory. Okay, they're holding back comments. It's tough negotiations, yes, and it's another shift in position by the war, and that he thinks originally Ukraine's going to win. Now, the Russian leader proposed a territorial swap in which Ukraine would cede the regions Donetsk and Luhansk in return for small parts of, I can't pronounce that one, and Kherson. One of the sources said US officials proposed exactly that swap to Zelensky in the meeting the following day. Ukrainians see a major strategic value in the portion of Donbass that they hold. They believe giving up the territory would make the rest of Ukraine much more vulnerable to Russian offensives. Well, okay. Now, the comments. No, it was further down. Now that everyone's woken up, they're putting different articles in because there are different answers. There was an article. Yeah, okay. So there's people here saying, look, that the 2014 was a coup d'etat. In essence, it wasn't really a coup, it wasn't military. But yeah, that there was a lot of Western influence. I think that's the safest thing to say. In the Euromaidan protests and everything else. Then the immediate suppression of Russian heritage and lack of Russian language and everything else basically came across as something made by Western Ukrainians who either didn't care or no longer wished to acknowledge the close ties that Eastern Ukrainians had. And they felt presumably that they had the moral authority to do so when, well, whole chunks of the country were like, well, no, we don't agree with it. And so it's been antagonistic ever since. Well, some people think it's Ukraine. Okay, yeah, these are people who don't like Trump. There was a comment down here. Get it done already, Trump. You won the popular vote, swing states, and the presidency on the promise of, well, not just that promise. He won, I think, his re-election based on economic grounds. Europe's goal for Ukraine are unachievable, unclear, and utopian. Yep, that's a fair comment. If the despicable regime creature Boris Johnson hadn't blown up the initial talks between Russia and Ukraine, this all could have been over. I think that's a fair statement as well. Everyone's an idiot. Blah, blah, blah. And then people are like, oh, we'll give Alaska back to Russia, Florida to Cuba. Blah. People are in denial, to be quite honest. But yeah, no. So that's that. And yeah, no, I think we'll call it there. We're in a pretty decent session today. All right, let's drop in the chat, put some tunes up, and close it out. Alrighty, big thank you to everyone coming out today. Regulars, first timers, chatters, lurkers, and everybody in between. Very much appreciate having you all here. And the channels wouldn't be the same without you. And thanks for the conversations and the chat. Alright, what do we got next? Is a gameplay stream tomorrow night. Pillars of Eternity. Then another Just Chatting stream on Thursday. And then Friday night is Prince of Persia Warriors Within. If you want to keep on top of things, keep an eye on the socials. Mainly Twitter and Insta. Messages go out in both of those before each stream, indicating what, where, when. And the Discord will pick up them eventually, and the Discord also punches a message out when the stream goes live. We've also got giveaways running on Discord to celebrate 3 years of giveaways, and so we're looking at giving away a copy of Let's School, Scare Ritual, and Amnesia the Bunker this week. If you'd like a chance at each of those, head for the Discord and you'll find a giveaways channel. Head in there, find the blue button, click the blue button for the giveaway you're interested in. You can go in all three if you'd like. And they'll be drawn before Sunday evening's stream, which at the moment is going to be Subnautica. Assuming I don't completely finish it on Saturday night. Unlikely. Alright. And that, big thank you again for everyone being here. And we'll see you all again next stream.